Welcome back to another episode of the BAAS How To series. We're really delighted to have here today Tom Cryer, who's a PhD candidate in history at UCL. And he's going to be talking to us today about that kind of really important topic for people towards the end of their PhD or just coming out of their PhD, which is how to publish your first journal article. So thank you for being here today, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
So many people's first journal articles are adapted from a chapter of their PhD thesis. So I thought it'd be useful to start off by asking you about some of the differences between an article and a thesis chapter.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. That was the route I went down to publishing my first academic article. And I think it's a really common one, and it's a common one for a good reason. With the PhD, you've done some of the groundwork, not all of it. You've done a huge amount of it, and you're an emerging expert in the conversation which you're trying to put your article within. So you've done more than you think. I think that road from PhD thesis to article, while it might take long, you are 80% of the way there already if you have a solid thesis chapter. Um, so yeah, that's what I'd say just at the outset. Um, I like to think of the journal article as something that's also joining the same conversation that your PhD is doing, but doing it in a different way. That's primarily because it's got different goals and different audiences. In terms of differences, first, they're kind of the more obvious ones. One, an article is typically shorter than a chapter. It'll be, and this kind of depends on the journal, about 8,000 words, 12,000 words, including footnotes. Often the journal article will probably be, depending on the average kind of UK thesis, about half a chapter. So I think it's really important to focus on the most important claim of the chapter from which you're trying to develop this article and the best part of that chapter, really. Um, I think it's really common, and this is a really important tip, when you're trying to turn a PhD thesis into an article, to think defensively. Think about what might people pick up on, what might people challenge, how can I guard myself against the comments of the peer reviewers. I don't think that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to be preemptive in anticipating critique, but it's also really important to think about the strengths that your article does have and focus the article around that because you haven't got too many words to play with. Um, what is the number one argument of the chapter? Basically, it's something we might not ask as much during a PhD because it's part of an overall piece. But I think getting your answer to that question, even in a sentence or so, is really kind of the first important step to turning PhD thesis chapter into article. So honing that one argument is the core of the entire article writing process. I think kind of trying to write a abstract for your chapter might be a useful starting point here. Um, there are other differences, of course. An article needs to stand alone in terms of references, narratives. It needs to introduce and make conclusions about a topic on its own. You can't leave unanswered questions for the next chapter like you would in a thesis. Basically, then you'll be taking a chapter and you'll kind of be splicing and copy and pasting in stuff from the introduction and conclusion that contextualizes and explains the topic to a first-time reader. And it's important to remember this is more than just some fairly heavy copy and pasting. A journal article ultimately has to be a wee bit more direct, a bit more to the point, a bit more argumentative. The best articles will shift conversations and really need to suggest in the first couple of pages how they are shifting that conversation. And it's always important to remember as well, your readers will not be supervisors with a pre-established interest or familiarity in the project. They may have no idea who you are. So it's really important, I think, the first couple of pages to quickly establish your voice and your reason for writing this piece in the first few pages. Um, Remember kind of going back, and it's many years ago for me, those PhD projects we wrote ages ago, just before we started the PhD, that said, why does my PhD matter? What are the stakes of my research? Why does it matter at a public level in some of the contemporary debates we're having at the moment? You need language a bit like this to kind of turn your PhD thesis chapter into an article. So what are the stakes? Why does this matter? And finally, your audience might be wider. Think about what your article needs to do to interest and be understandable to those outside your field, including in the general public and including in undergraduates or master's level students if you think your research will be useful in teaching. So I think the PhD thesis is close to an article. There are some small differences, but those are bridgeable over the process, and the peer review process will help you to do that. So don't at all feel intimidated when looking at that chapter and thinking, where do I go with this?
Yeah, I think that point that you're kind of 80% of the way there is a really helpful and reassuring one. Yeah, I think you've done a really good job of outlining those kind of shifts in focus and audience you might need to consider. So when you're working on your first journal article, How do you decide which is the right journal to kind of send your article to?
Yeah, thank you. Another really great question. And this is quite tricky, I think. I think talking to other PhD students and things like the sciences or the social sciences, a lot is put on journal rank, a lot is put on impact factor, which can be great. Those sources are widely available if you do want to Google them and if you consider those important. I'd consider them important, but I don't think they're the entirety of the picture. That kind of gets across where your journal might be after the production process, should it be accepted. What you also really want are those personal stories of the process of going through that peer review process, particularly when you're a first time journal author. So I think it's really important to get those personal perspectives on the journal experience within particular journals and to find a journal that really welcomes early career scholars. To say some ways of doing that, you might find that out by looking at PGRs, ECRs, and conferences that you're going to. Where have they published? Maybe you saw it on Twitter or Blue Sky a few months back. Where have your own supervisors published? Another thing to do would maybe be to look at ECRs, ECRs that you might admire, people whose work you might admire, people you consider working in a similar field to you, and think about where they first published their article. I think people, if you talk to them, are always quite keen to talk about the experiences with journals and the experiences of working with particular journals. So I think that's another useful tip. Um, yeah, finally, I'd say work about your kind of Zotero, your list of bibliographies, all the stuff you're using in your thesis, and think about where is that published. That's a good sign that the conversations you were having as a thesis or as a journal article are a good fit for that journal. Um, Open access journals, journal with open access arrangements with your university are also really great because that means people can read your journal, your article, your research free of charge, and that expands the audience. Um, I recognize this is a BAAS produced video, so it's preaching to the choir, but I think the Journal of American Studies is a great start for anyone working in American Studies. Um, in terms of other advice, I think it's useful to think about how it might look on your CV. If you want to get American Studies job, if you want to work in American Studies, if you define yourself as an American Studies researcher, having the Journal of American Studies, it's kind of an obvious step to do that. Conversely, if you want to go in, I don't know, intellectual history, having something called modern intellectual history on your CV provides a nice way to signal that and signpost your identity as a scholar. Um, Two last things. One thing I heard from a colleague, which I think was quite interesting, is don't be afraid to be ambitious, particularly if you're working on a fairly concentrated topic, regardless of the journal you send your article to, you might get the same peer reviewers. So try be ambitious. Your peer reviewers might be the same, regardless of what journal you go to. Um, and finally, most importantly, I think this is something that really benefited me was do your research on the journal before submitting, read its content, familiarize yourself with its recent articles, check its aims and scopes, understand its audiences, have a think about its style, its themes, its methodology. And it always helps when submitting to peer review to cite journal articles that have been published in that journal before. It shows that you're a regular reader. I think that's a nice thing to showcase to the editorial board. So yeah, try mix the stats and the personal perspectives, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful, thorough response. So I've got my article written. I've picked a journal to send it to. What happens then? What happens once I submit my article?
Yeah, sure. A lot happens. I think the first thing I'd say is that this can be a long process. I know we're going to talk about this in a wee bit, but this might be about a year from first submission to publication, if not more. So that's important to bear in mind first. So yeah, as you said, you first submit your article, checking it matches the house styles, which can be found online. Those always take a bit of time, but it's important to do. There's often an online submission portal, which you might not have used before, but don't be intimidated. The guides are normally out there. It can take a while, but just make sure all the attachments are the right attachments. You've uploaded the most recent piece, really important. Um, and it shouldn't be too difficult from that. You also might need an abstract and title at this point. Um, and I'd first kind of say, if you submitted an article, well done. Celebrate that. It's an 8,000 word piece. It's a huge amount of intellectual labor. It's a huge amount of time. And if your supervisors have recommended you submit to a journal, that should be something that should be celebrated, regardless of what happens next. So once you've submitted the journal article, then two things will happen. And this kind of depends upon the journal. Normally, the editorial board of the journal may read it and see if it's a good fit for the journal, making sure it meets the submission guidelines, making sure it kind of looks like the other pieces that are published in that journal. This is where you might get a quick note, maybe even within a week, that says maybe your methodology suits another journal. This might be a bit too niche for a general history journal, something like that. If that happens, that's not a problem at all. Don't be upset. Don't be intimidated. It's really just the editorial board of that journal trying to find the best journal for your piece where it can kind of shine and best make the most impact. Um, if the article seems a good fit, then it will go to peer review. You might not be told whether it's going, so try be patient. I'd say as a good rule of thumb, if you don't hear something within kind of a 6 month time span, that might be when you want to follow up. Um, Peer review is a unique process, but generally peer reviewers are looking for quality, originality, accuracy, and contribution. Again, this might take a while. It's a particular problem with journal publishing at the moment that peer reviewers might be a wee bit difficult to find. So 4 to 6 months would probably be a constructive time frame. Hopefully, 6 or so months later, you'll get a constructive and useful peer review report, which will give one of three overall suggestions. Do not publish, revisions, or publish as is. Most journals I work with no longer kind of give the major minor revisions categories you might have heard of from your supervisors, but you can kind of guess normally by reading the feedback whether substantial work is needed or whether it's more of a tidy up effort. If there are suggested revisions, you'll be invited to resubmit the article, and then it may go back to a third reviewer, someone who hasn't reviewed it before, or back to the same reviewers. Finally, if successful, you have the final editing and copy editing to remove typos, errors, ensure your footnotes meet the style guides, stuff like this. Then it will be published. Congratulations. That'll either be online first or in a first view kind of type format, which is what the Journal of American Studies do. That's really great. And publication timeline is something to think about when choosing an article, excuse me. Um, or it might be published in a printed journal. What I say at this point is please make sure if your university has an open access arrangement, again, to increase your audience as much as possible. That's something to really worth looking into and ask the editors that you're corresponding with if that would interest you. Um, all that's to say that might sound like a long process. That's because it is. Um, But I think it's always worth thinking about how you can kind of get a glimpse of that process in a shorter, lower stakes manner. So, for example, writing a book review or publishing a piece with a peer-reviewed blog, for example, might give you experience of how that kind of process works in a slightly less lengthy, slightly less intimidating format. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long process, but a worthwhile one.
Yeah.
Can you just talk in a little bit more detail about the peer review process? Because I think that's something that might seem the most kind of alien or the most intimidating to first-time journal article writers.
Yeah, completely. If you find that process intimidating, don't be intimidated because a lot of people do. Even the best scholars started off being intimidated by peer review because it's a very unique process to have someone you have never read and might never know who they are read your work. So it is scary. Nonetheless, I'd say first that if your article has gone to peer review, if the journal has put it out and went into the effort of finding peer reviewers for you, that's a sign of confidence. They're doing that because they believe in your piece and they believe that with changes, it can be publishable and it can be important. So even if peer review, something comes back you might not like, please know that to get that far in the process is a great success. And again, that needs celebrating. Um, I think every scholar can't help but feel slightly disheartened when a peer review comes back. The comments might seem minor, they might seem slightly nitpicky. You might want to just get on with life, get on with your weekend, get this off your desk, continue with your thesis. The reviewers aren't there to critique, they're ultimately to make the article the best it can be. This is to make the article better, no matter how it feels when you're reading it at the time that you receive that peer review. And I think you might find, and this is something really important for early career scholars, is that the feedback you're getting again from these anonymous people who can kind of speak from a position of anonymity might be some of the best feedback you get during the course of your PhD. And it could be really valuable for orienting your overall project and kind of shaping and improving your thinking on the thesis. So I'd say open that email. Don't put it off, which is something I'll admit to doing a few times. But I think open it as soon as possible and read it thoroughly. And then just give yourself a few days to digest, to maybe get over the emotional response that you might have, then get back to it. I know lives are busy. I know PGR lives particularly really busy. But I think going away from an article ultimately takes a bit more time when you have to refamiliarize yourself with it. So kind of strike while the iron's hot. Um, in terms of approaching revisions, I'd first see if maybe a colleague or supervisor can help maybe decipher some of that peer review letter. They might know the project, they might kind of know where the peer reviewer might want you to go. If the reviewer suggests a certain book you might read, they might, say this could be helpful as well. So just read the peer review letter a few times over, ensure you're doing those recommendations. Often when you get that letter and it could be 3 or 4 pages long, these are substantial pieces of writing. It can be helpful to break that down into a to-do list, just tick boxes, starting with the most basic. And I think that's a nice way to kind of guide yourself into it and kind of start going slowly up that progression to answering their critique in a manageable manner. Um, Once you've done all that, then you'll resubmit, and that is the place for something called the peer review letter. This is quite a unique piece of writing, and I don't think it's anything anyone ever prepared me to write. This is basically where you say, I recognize the reviewer's comments, and this is what I've done in response to this. I think, first of all, I say this is really, really important. While we don't talk about it too much, it's really the point at which you signal, I've taken your advice on board. So, 3 kind of tips for that. Number one, be humble, respectful. Don't be defensive, be positive. You're working with the feedback. Tip, try to be comprehensive and readable. I think peer reviewers and editorial boards both really appreciate it if in that decision response letter, you're clearly outlining what you've done and why you've done it. I think that saves them time, and it means that when they go back into rereading your piece and looking, how have they answered my critique? Have they kind of got what I wanted them to do? It means they go in there with a positive mindset and benefit and feel like you're a collaborator in this process. So I think having that nice, positive, welcoming tone, welcoming their critique, being thankful for their feedback is really important. And then third piece of advice, just please acknowledge editorial staff and their work in facilitating this. It can often go under acknowledged, it can often go under remunerated, but it's such important work. And I think thanking them is a nice gesture, scholar to scholar. Um, Finally, probably final thing here, you don't need to incorporate every single change. I think you can read that list. You can see, there are 20 things for me to do with this article. I need to do 20 out of them. Maybe not. Don't feel scared to say no. There's only so much you can fit into the word limit of your piece ultimately. If you don't want to make that change, completely fine, but try justify it. I've had many times, this will be something UK-based scholars might get a lot. Why don't you go to this archive in Washington, DC or something? I don't have the money for that plane ticket. You can say that. You can be that honest, I think. So don't feel like you have to go to a new archive just because of peer review. If you're going to be there, great. If you can't make it, not too much of an issue. If you feel adding a suggested point might kind of distract or dilute from your overall argument, that's also completely fair. I think acknowledge that point, address why you think it might distract from your argument, and say that with confidence and with politeness, but don't feel that you have to do everything they recommend, and ultimately don't get moved too far from what you think is your main line of argument in making this article, that kind of red line. Don't get moved too far from that, and ensure that the key argumentative thread must run through the entirety of the article when responding to peer review. Um, yeah, and again, as I said on the top, this is a collaborative process and it's to make the article better. So just try, maintain faith in the process. It's a long one, but it does work.
Yeah. Yeah, finally, I wanted to ask about the length of the process. You've kind of mentioned it can sometimes take upwards of a year. I wonder if you could just finally speak a little bit about the kind of length and ups and downs of the process.
Yeah, I'll give the cop-out answer there, which is that it all depends on the journal. It all depends how quickly peer reviewers can be found. It all depends how quickly you can respond to the peer review process. But I think if you're first submitting an article, I'd guess probably around 1 year, 3 to 6 months to receive your first decision, 3 months probably to revise at your end to resubmit that article, and then another 3 months for the second decision. And then after that, maybe a couple more months for final proofing, etc. And keep in mind, if this is a print journal, it might be a bit longer. It might be 6 to 12 months onto that. So going on to more like a year and a half. So it's really important to be patient here. Don't hesitate to get politely in contact. If it's been, I'd say 5 or 6 months will kind of be the golden area to get in contact. But I think patience is always needed in this kind of process. Such an important piece of advice, and I kind of wish I heard this earlier, was that keep that timeline in mind. If you want to go into the job market at the end of your PhD, it needs some preparation. if possible, the ideal time to first submit that journal article so that it gets out when you're first getting on the job market would be towards the end of your second year. I know that sounds slightly intimidating. I know you might not feel slightly ready if you're reading this maybe at the start of your second year or the end of your first year, thinking about journal articles within the next year. But I just at the end of it come back to what I said at the beginning. If you think the ideas that you have could benefit from refining, if you've been suggested that those ideas could make a difference, go for it. The old cliche, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? I think that's really important to think about. And as I said, the PhD thesis is such an important part of work. And it's about, bringing that to new audiences and letting that research shine by making it into an article. You are a lot of the way there already. So don't feel intimidated going into this process. Um, and finally, I'd say you might have listened to us over the last 15 to 20 minutes and said, this sounds incredibly complicated and it sounds like a very long process. Why should I do it? And I'd say articles are just an extraordinary thing. They're the beating heart of academia. They're how everything happens. They're how most of our research gets disseminated. They're how we find new ideas. They're how we teach. They're how we're judged on the job market. And even if this is a long, daunting process, I think having your article out there reflecting your PhD research is such an exciting thing because that'll be there, for time immemorial. That's a unique thing. And that's an exciting privilege and achievement. So if you're sitting here thinking, this sounds like a lot, I don't know if this is for me, have a go, see what happens. It's a collaborative process. And if it does go well for you, congratulations. That's a fantastic privilege. So yeah, good luck with it. And it'll be a unique kind of fun, but I think everyone sitting back at the end of their published journal article reflects only with pride on that experience. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I think this is a really kind of measured and considerate approach to thinking about the first journal article, which I think will be of so much help to so many BAAS, PGR, and ECR members. So thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much.